Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. I'm Bryce Yonker, and today we have two fantastic guests with us, which we're very excited to have. Jeff Guldner, coming in from the CEO of Pinnacle West, and our friend Phil Moeller from EEI. Jeff and Phil, thanks for being on.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce.
Yeah, appreciate the chance to talk about this stuff.
Let's let you guys introduce yourself. Jeff, tell us a little about who you are and what led you to that role there.
Yeah, so I'm Jeff Guldner. I'm CEO of Pinnacle West Capital Corporation. That's the holding company for Arizona Public Service, or APS. And so we operate Arizona's largest electric utility, vertically integrated utility. We serve about 1.4 million customers, a pretty cool service territory because it's about half the metro Phoenix area. So we got that dense urban service territory, but then we're up in some of the sparsest territory when you get up towards the Grand Canyon, northern Arizona. We've got iconic cities like Tombstone, Arizona, Bisbee, Douglas area, moving towards a zero carbon plan right now to be zero carbon by 2050. A key component of that's going to be our nuclear plant. And so we operate Palo Verde Generating Station for about 7 different owners in the Southwest. Still the largest nuclear plant, I think, although Vogtle 4 is about to take us out of that distinction, but that's a key component of our decarbonization plan.
Thanks, Jeff. Phil, how about yourself? What led you to that role, and what are you doing now?
Right. Well, I've had a career in energy policy, first in my home state of Washington for the Washington State Senate, and then a U.S. Senator from Washington State here in Washington, D.C. Spent some time in the private sector, served 2 terms on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I'm with the EEI. Have been here for about 8 years. We're the association of all the investor-owned electric companies in this country. And of course, we're very happy that Jeff's company is one of our members.
Happy to be a member too, Phil.
All right, Jeff and Phil, we're going to ask you just a simple question to start things off. What's going on for utilities around the country? I'll start with you, Phil. What's top of mind for the grid operators across this country? And, we'll cover a number of these topics, but thought we could just lay the foundation with that intro.
Well, I think if we look back about the last 15 years, up until recently, we've had a lot of stability. We've had low interest rates, low inflation, no issues with the supply chain, and an incredible, bountiful ability to have domestic natural gas essentially keep electricity prices very low and sometimes below inflation. That has changed. The factors that I mentioned have changed. We're now seeing some incredible demand. Jeff's service territory is seeing some that's just kind of knocks your socks off, but we're seeing it everywhere. And that's a good problem to have, but it's still full of challenges, not only because of the things that I mentioned, supply chain, higher interest rates, higher inflation, but also because the regulatory community has not had to deal with these issues with these conditions.
Double down on any of those, Jeff, or anything new that's top of mind there?
No, I'd say the explosive demand growth is probably the most challenging strategic issue that I think I've seen in my career, and it is something that is coming on fast in Arizona. We've got Taiwan Semiconductor, so if you think that's a strategic national imperative for the country, and if they build all of the fabs out, that plant alone would be about 1,000 megawatts. We're an 8,000 megawatt summer peaking system. So you're talking about one big nationally significant chip manufacturer could add 1,000 megawatts to that. Add on the manufacturing growth that's supporting that, some additional manufacturing that's coming to Arizona. And the challenge now is how do you serve that? So we're retiring coal. We're going to have a coal unit retire here pretty soon, and we're going to have one more that will retire in the early 2030s. And so this load is different because it's very high load factor, and so it's a much more challenging solution when you start stacking data centers and manufacturing, along with the residential growth that's coming along with that. So a ton of time is being spent on that. We're also then dealing with wildfire mitigation. And so there's a lot of focus throughout the West and really now around the country on just making sure that we're staying on top of doing everything that we can do around wildfires. And then how do you get new innovation coming on the supply side? And so just thinking about some of the new exciting technologies out there is something we're spending a lot of time on.
Well, let's start where you guys started. This was my first question. So it seems reasonably apparent that there's increased thrust for electricity demand, really whatever your service area is, right? You've got transportation electrifying, building electrifying, industrial loads, data centers, and the demand curve just seems to be bending, right? Every new report that comes out seems to be bending that upward. And I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, there was that federal announcement about the chip investment from Intel out that way, right? So there's so much going on. How do grid operators deal with this increased load? Like, what does it look like to roll your sleeves up and start creating some solution sets? Maybe you can start, Jeff, and then Phil, you can add.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you've got to look, I think, critically to is how do you maximize the resources that we have? And so, I think the opportunity to expand the markets, and we've got kind of a couple of competing different market structures that are evolving in the Western interconnection. We're already partnered with California ISO on the real-time energy imbalance market, but long term, you've got to figure out how do we maximize the value of the resources that we have and take advantage of whatever resource diversity that we have. But a lot of these new loads are going to drive needs for additional transmission and additions to just the distribution grid. And I think that's where Phil had mentioned the supply chain challenges. We've got to get our head around the transformer challenges in this country. And, I don't think it's going to be okay for us to say it takes 6 to 7 years to order a transformer to serve some of these big loads. So I think we're going to have to not just solve the generation side and maximize what we have, but we're also going to have to really tackle that supply chain challenge and say, let's get more high level transformers on the grid so that we can accommodate these higher loads.
Yeah, our first podcast 2 ago, the White House called out the Siemens investment that they've made to onshore some of that. So onshoring of it, I think, is part of the solution.
Yep.
Jeff, Phil, what to your mind, like as far as dealing with increased demand across the country, are there some best practices you're seeing? Is there some kind of ways, like I said, to roll up your sleeves to get at this effectively?
Well, as Jeff mentioned, transmission is going to be a key. It's been kind of my highest general policy priority for most of my career, but it's extraordinarily difficult to get it built, not only because of the siting, cost allocation, and the various public policies that are in flux, but the premise is pretty basic. You have a larger footprint for dispatch. It helps you deal with time of day changes, weather changes, as we have more variable resources entering the grid. We do see a lot of retirements that are coming on with base load in various areas. Some of those have been delayed, but it makes, to your original question, the operation of the grid very challenging. Now, obviously, if most of your listeners are in the West, they're more familiar with what the market structure is in the West. And Jeff mentioned a couple of competing proposals to try and get that greater efficiency out of what's there now.
Well, maybe I hadn't planned to talk about this at this point, but maybe let's talk about markets. This is the theme of our main event this year. I'm calling 2024 kind of the year of markets here in the West. How are markets going to help with resource adequacy, maybe resiliency? We're going to talk about resiliency. You talked about increased demand, but how is that resource diversity and bringing those varying assets, from different geographies into the market? How do those next steps in the energy markets? Why is that so important?
Yeah, Bryce. I'll start with just the one of the key things that's happening in the background to all this is the RAP, the Western Resource Adequacy Program, and that's going to be fundamental, because if you're relying on kind of other, like we're very comfortable relying on our generation.
Yeah.
As soon as you start to depend on other people's generation, you really want to make sure that's there, particularly in the day ahead markets. And ultimately, that could bring a lot of savings to customers, because you can change your planning reserve margin. And you got to remember the real savings is typically in lower planning reserve margins, not having to go build stuff to serve that load. And so if we can get that framework right to where we can depend on the resources that are bidding into a day ahead market, then you really have the chance to optimize around the West. What I'd love to see, and it's going to take a lot of transmission, But, long-term vision, I'd love to see that connectivity where you can bring the hydro down from the Pacific Northwest, the solar up from the desert Southwest, and the wind in from the eastern part of the interconnection. And so the long-term goal of these markets is getting us to that spot where we'll ultimately get transmission aligned to get the resources optimized.
Yeah, the West was always thought of as winter peaking in the Northwest, summer peaking in the Southwest. And you're seeing more and more areas around the country where winter peaks are starting to be equivalent to summer peaks. And that's a big dynamic change that the industry is dealing with. And outside the West, it gets deliciously complicated, because if you look at something like New England, I think people have long seen the challenges there with a lack of natural gas pipeline capacity into the region, particularly in the winter where it's most acute. But also take a PJM footprint, 13 states, District of Columbia, and most of our members in that footprint are not allowed to own generation. So there are retirements by companies that make the decision to retire, but they don't have the obligation to serve that utilities have. And that's a fundamental difference from someone who just happens to invest in a power plant. And so solving the problem, I always tell people, look to what's happening in Ohio. The demand growth around Columbus is just stunning, with factories, chips factories, and our member companies there, can't own the generation. So it's reliant on the market signals to make sure it's built. And sometimes it's probably want to be built in areas that are ideal, but maybe don't have the transmission capacity to send the power out. So it's extraordinarily difficult, but it plays out a little bit differently in each region of the country.
Yep. So let's pivot slightly on a topic I think I've covered almost every session. It's grid resilience, right? The impact of situations that are seeming to keep coming at us more frequently seems to raise, right? So higher frequency, higher impact events. You all down in Arizona, I can't remember how many days it was that were 110. I couldn't believe how resilient your system was. So I wouldn't necessarily call that a resiliency event, but that was scary, right?
Yep.
So how do we invest in the grid to deal with these resilience pressures? What does it look like to make those investments effectively?
Yeah, and just using that example, I think it was 53 days that we were above 110. And one of the biggest challenges for the folks that are actually out on the front line keeping the lights on is the nighttime lows. On those days, the nighttime low is typically not dropping below 100. And so if you think of your average kind of residential transformer that is sitting out serving 4 or 5 homes, that transformer is heating up during the day, and then it's not really getting a chance to cool down at night. And so, as I look back over the last 20 years here at APS, a lot of focus on just having those systems where you're monitoring, you get data, you're watching for transformer loading so that you can change out equipment. But I think that there's been a change really around what I'd say is climate resilience, which is we've got to be thinking about, like, how are these hotter summers? How is that affecting our power plants? We had an example where I think one of our chiller went down on one of our gas-fired plants, which was critical for hitting our peak that day. And you actually had folks who were going out to Circle K buying bags of ice to throw bags of ice on just so that we didn't have to take that plant off until we got through the peak. And so there's, you want to have a probably better system than the Circle K system to do that, but we have to be thinking about that climate resilience to say you can do Herculean things to keep the power plants running through that period. And I think the folks that are on the front lines that do that just deserve a ton of credit for the work they do, but investing long term in some of those resiliency plays so that we're getting good data, we're getting good monitoring of the equipment, we understand when we need to change it out, and then we look at backup systems that can help ensure that we keep those running.
Well, folks don't often get kudos for the catastrophe that didn't happen, but congratulations on the system continuity during that event. Phil, anything in particular on your end for resiliency as far as best practices? And I know making those investments can be hard to justify until, well, we needed them. and in which case it's catastrophic. So, what are some of the ways you see that, making the proactive investments going well?
Well,
works?
Bryce, you made the point exactly, which is how do you justify the event that didn't happen? Well, it's difficult, but it's the same concept of insurance, essentially, that you're paying now. And getting a more resilient system, as noted, we've seen just more extreme weather and all types of it, from droughts that then contribute potentially to wildfires, to hurricanes, to cold snaps where people weren't used to it. And so what we try and do, because for the most part, these investments have to be approved by regulators. And so we try and give them examples, and we have a few of them, but probably the one that's most notable that people can relate to is that after the hurricanes in Florida, 2003, 4 in there, they made a very proactive effort to harden their grid. I think the initial tranche was about an $8 billion investment. But their studies showed that just 1 day out of electricity for Florida was a $1 billion hit to the economy. It's probably even higher now. And so they were able to show that they could get their outage times down from, multiple days to 1 or 2. And that narrative, which is based on facts, goes a long way to kind of showing to regulators that this is a good insurance policy to essentially embrace to avoid the disasters.
Anything else on your end on grid hardening? I know kind of the wildfire topic would fit into this space, Jeff, and you had mentioned some work in that front. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's the sort of actions that you can take, the PSPS type actions that can help reduce risk, but ultimately, and it's the same as Phil was talking about, it's the investments that are required. I go back a few years ago, the meteorologist was kind of the weather channel. And, you had folks who had pretty good understanding of that, but you didn't have full-time meteorologists on staff, and that's changed. So now you're investing in the people that can do that. We've got a meteorology team that is out looking at the weather, breaking it down across the service territory, and then investing in those weather stations and the cameras and getting the real-time data so that you can do it. It's super hard to underground in a lot of parts of our service territory. So I think that's a great idea if you can do it. And we see in the metro areas that we're generally an underground system, but when you get up into the rocky mountainous terrain, it gets really hard to do that. And so you've got to look for other technologies, other risk mitigation strategies that you can employ there. But it does come back to that resilience. It really is about saying what kind of overlapping, duplicating, defense in depth kind of systems can you put in place so that you've got multiple strategies that are aligning to help minimize the chance of wildfire.
Costly distribution upgrades, frequent extreme weather events, demand surging from an onslaught of distributed energy resources adoption. Do these challenges sound familiar? If so, you need Virtual Peaker's cloud-based distributed energy platform. We're empowering modern utilities with the tools needed in the new energy landscape. The Virtual Peaker platform unifies all aspects of DER management, from DERMS to customer engagement and demand forecasting. Learn more at virtual-peaker.com.
So let's talk about a neighboring topic to resiliency, and I'll broadly call it flexibility. So, historically, that might have been very much thought of as like peakers, right, and reserve margin. But, demand side management programs, energy storage, virtual power plants, time varying rates. There's quite a toolkit of what you can use to add the necessary flexibility on energy systems that are quite varying these days. So maybe Phil, you can start. What are you seeing out there that you think is working well and we need to work on scaling? And then I'm sure we'll have some other side conversations around this.
Well, Jeff pointed out in his earlier comments, what we need to do, certainly for the rest of this decade, is as we have changes and we bring more resources on and some retire, we need to use the present system as efficiently as possible. And when it comes down to distribution rates, we have to make sure that we're sending the right signals for people to essentially shave peak and fill in the troughs with their consumption. And you can't expect customers to be altruistic. You have to give them the kind of rate signals that make sense to modify their behavior. And so there's a lot of good work going on right now about more dynamic pricing throughout various jurisdictions. We have an effort where we bring regulators, consumer advocates, and the industry together to kind of talk through a major subject that's a year-long topic. And our subject this year on that is actually more dynamic rate making. And so everybody's involved, and the education effort is important. But what's, to me, very interesting is that Arizona's been a leader, and Jeff's been in the middle of this for 20 years on more creative rates, demand charges. And so really looking to a lot of what Arizona has done is worthwhile.
Yeah, the opportunities here, this is a particular passion of mine. The opportunities here are enormous. And I think it's something for regulators and policymakers that are listening. This is an area to really spend some time trying to understand. And the key thing is what Phil mentioned, it's that price signal. And just to give you a simple example, not yet talking about virtual power plants, but simply having time differentiated rates, what we see on a typical day, no demand response call, just a typical summer day, at 4 o'clock p.m., our system peak drops by like 100 megawatts. And you can just see it drop. And that is somebody's thermostat setting that probably is one of the old manual thermostats that's on the wall, right? That just says at 4 p.m., turn my thermostat up. And then we get about 130, I think, on the beginning, and then we get about 100 megawatt snapback at 7 when that time differentiated period ends. And that's just customers. That's not a signal. That's not anything. That's just standard rate design that's bringing the equivalent of a couple of peakers to the system. And the nuance there is that rate design is really important, because if you do it, and I've seen some time use rate designs where there's a really small on-peak, off-peak price difference, because I think the regulators think that that's going to help, it won't cause shock and customers will be fine with it. That won't get you the action. If all I can do is save, a couple of bucks over the course of a year, I'm not going to go out and do anything with my thermostat or invest the time to understand how to do it. And so what we see is on our time of use with demand rates, a customer actually has an incentive to go put other things on their home, a span system to manage, that demand, to actually do some work on the pool pump. The most popular rate we have with customers is our time of use with demand rate, and about 30% of our customers are on that rate. And when I tell regulators in other states that, they're just like, that can't be right. And it is, and it's because people choose to go on that rate because they can invest in things that can save them money. And so just figuring out ways that you can use that basic rate design will bring significant benefit to the system and help avoid some of that infrastructure that we need to invest in.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe go to, and you can take it a little bit on a tangent if you need to, but let's maybe go a little deeper. Distributed energy resources, the value that they can bring on the grid, obviously been a very hot topic, for some years now. Just these last couple of years, a lot of conversation around what a virtual power plant can look like, right? An operator has access to a number of resources, pushes a button, and boom, resources show up. So what some of the more sophisticated solutions, what do those look like now? How mature are they, and how ready are they to scale? Because scale is what matters. If it's something that's going to impact true grid operations.
Yeah, and I think the easiest example on that is just we have a program called Cool Rewards, and it's a smart thermostat program. It's non-denominational, so multiple different thermostat vendors can participate in the program, and it is that push button type of operation where we have the ability. We pay a customer to join the program. And I'll give you one kind of cool feature on this, but we have about 83,000 devices as of last summer, and that was bringing us 140 megawatts with that push-the-button dependability. So again, that's separate from that rate design we talked about. That's Cool Rewards, a demand response program, which is a virtual power plant of about 140, and I think scalable. The cool feature in the design is that if any individual customer, when you get that scale, if an individual customer says, you know what, I'm having a party here tonight, and so I can't have my thermostat go up a few degrees, so they can turn it down and override it. Does not affect their participation in the program, does not affect the benefits they get, because when we have those kind of numbers, we know that the vast majority of customers don't opt out. And so it is that key to getting scale. And I think there are multiple hundreds of megawatts that can come from just thermostats. And if you start thinking now about pool pumps, you start thinking about other assets in the home where you can have that kind of flexibility and not running your pool pump between 4 and 7 p.m. You can create some real value for both the grid and for that individual customer. And so I think there's tremendous potential in those virtual power plants with very simple technology and tools.
Bill, anything else on kind of where the next steps of DER integration is heading and how we scale it?
Well, DERs are an exciting part of the future. For those of us who are deep into the regulatory world, though, we want them to be compensated at a fair amount and not have someone else subsidize their compensation, because that's, first of all, from an economics perspective, wrong, but also regressive in terms of who's impacted the most on that. So making sure that the fixed charges on a customer's bill are accurately reflecting the cost of maintaining the grid is very important. The compensation that they get then is also very important so that they're not overpaid. And I think there's some exciting things out there about managed storage so that it can be optimized to not overload the grid. Going back to what Jeff said earlier, we want to avoid unnecessary grid enhancements that can be avoided if the system is optimized more ideally.
Yeah, and just on that, just quickly, Bryce, I think over time that residential storage, and whether it's battery storage or a different kind, thermal storage, where you're optimizing a rooftop solar, that's going to be key as well, Tara. As I should have said, we've got, I think, about 1 in 4 residential homes, single-family residential homes in our territory has rooftop solar on the system. So it is a big resource in our mix. It's just trying to figure out how do we use storage somewhere. It could be thermal in a home, it could be grid side storage, but shift that production from the middle of the day over onto that 4 to 8 or 9 p.m. period. That's coming. I think we'll get better and better at that.
Let's jump all the way over to the other side of the grid. So transmission, I think many would argue, is quite needed now to do what we want on the grid. But I think the further you look out, the more certain is we need transmission to bring the right load to the right demand centers. Transmission build out is not capital light. How do we fund transmission? How do we get stakeholder alignment? What are some of the pathways to get going on transmission now, knowing that it's only going to be increasing in the need that we have for it as the future comes upon us? Jeff, maybe you can start.
Yeah, we do pretty good at getting transmission that's in the local area, so we can get 500 kV and 230 kV transmission built out around the footprint to serve, a new subdivision or some of the loads coming in there. But your point's spot on. Is it's trying to find those long lines that are going to go between regions or planning regions is where we've got to get the investment. I think actually one of the things that would make the capital easier to attract is federal permitting reform. And so just the importance, it is not okay to take 10 years working on a single transmission project that is yet to see, a shovel turn any dirt in the ground. And yet everybody can look around and say it's a great line. And as some of these lines get built, we'll all jump in. When you look around the grid out here in the West, almost every transmission line, there's maybe a piece that APS owns, there's a piece the Salt River Project owns, Public Service New Mexico has a piece. And so you can allocate that capital in a pretty efficient way once the projects actually get into that construction phase. It's just got to go faster because it's so hard to put the money in, the investment in, with the uncertainty that you see from these really long lead time transmission projects.
Yeah, I think we can look back to pre-Order 1000 and what happened in the Midwest. And we commissioned a history paper on this from some people who were involved. I was on the commission when we approved that tranche of projects, again, pre-Order 1000. But it took some time, but a bunch of states with direction from their governors got together and figured out, in anticipation of where particularly the wind resources were coming, how do we get that to the load centers in the Midwest? And it took a while, and the final one, approved over 10 years ago, is under construction now. But there are examples out there. I think there are parts of Order 1000 that have actually made the system less efficient and more expensive. We feel, and not everyone's going to agree with this, but what FERC proposed with restoring the right of first refusal for the incumbents, as long as they partner with someone, as Jeff noted, it would be a recipe for getting more transmission built sooner. And I think you can look to the project that Elite, the parent of Minnesota Power, is proposing to connect the eastern and western interconnections as a creative way to solve what's been out there as a challenge for that upper tier of the country.
We don't have a lot of time, but I want to cover two things. So let's try to be brief on, exciting and complex topics here. So as far as federal funding, the tax incentives, the consumer rebates, the grid grants, the loans, it's a major portfolio. What do you expect that the impact of this tranche of funds will have in the near and midterm on the grid? Do you have any kind of future vision as to the near term, what this is going to kind of really accomplish?
Yeah, I think it's accelerating, obviously, the investment. The biggest challenge you've got when you've got to add significant new resources, for us, it's primarily battery and solar storage, is customer affordability. And when you can have the highest capacity factor solar with batteries that are all being supported with some of the tax credit incentives, that lowers cost to customers. And so that's letting you put more of that on faster at a lower cost to the consumer. And so I think it's been a really positive way to allocate capital efficiently to those. Let the developers and the market operators decide where that needs to go, but have the resources to bring the cost down to customers.
Great. Thoughts from you, Phil, on that?
Well, I focus more on the transmission side, and I think it can be an opportunity to, again, highlight really joint projects. The projects say that better interconnect SPP and MISO, not a whole lot of money, but it sends a signal, particularly to the state regulators who will have to approve the cost allocation, that the federal government has something in the game here too, as a way to benefit the reliability and affordability of the grid.
And we focus a lot on the grid aspects, right? So we focus on the grid resilience grants, the smart grid grants, and those are going to carry forward commercially ready solutions in a way that I think is very responsible. I'm super optimistic. I think they're going to have a really big impact in the near term. And it's going to be very different than what we saw in 2008. So, well, great. Well, last question. Last question here is really about kind of what's exciting you, right? What excites you in the industry right now? Whether it's innovations that are driving forward or some things that we didn't maybe think historically were possible that are now becoming reality. What's catching your attention now, and how do we really take the ball forward on some exciting things that we need to move ahead? I'll start with you, Jeff, and give you the last word, Phil.
Yeah, this to me, it's on the supply side of how can we think about these dispatchable, lower zero carbon resources that can bring that firm power supply to the growing grid that we're seeing. And I think the nuclear technology is going to come, and data centers are probably going to advance that faster than if they were not out there, but that's still probably an early to mid 2030s solution. And so what are the other opportunities? The one that's got me particularly excited right now is thinking about those deep geothermal technologies, where you're seeing a lot more conversation happening about being able to drill deeply and figure out a way to get geothermal energy out of the ground. And that could be really valuable as that baseload power supply that could help fill in. Whether it can get done before the advanced nuclear projects can happen, but I sure think we should be spending time thinking about the opportunity for some of those non-traditional generation resources that can provide that baseload.
Great. Last word over to you, Phil.
Well, electrification in general is pretty exciting, and the potential of AI to help us manage some of this is huge, but a lot to get our arms around. I'm excited by the fact that there is a growing and almost universal recognition that we do have these resource adequacy problems challenges throughout the country. And at least recognition is the first step in coming to some solutions. And on the distribution side, Jeff mentioned the technology that's out there, that's blossoming, a lot of opportunities to be more efficient in using that, virtual power plants, and also the recognition that I noted earlier that more and more regulators and consumer advocates are seeing that better pricing signals are a key part of using the existing system more efficiently. And again, solutions are going to play out differently in each jurisdiction. But the recognition that this is a positive thing and to look at positive examples like what's happened with APS and their successes is great and actually quite exciting.
Jeff Guldner, Phil Moeller, thanks for being on with us and chatting. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Bryce.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thanks again to our season sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Forward Chats, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.